So, let's talk about Isaiah 53. This chapter in the Bible is a big deal. It's one of the most famous, most debated, and most powerful pieces of writing in the entire Old Testament. It paints a picture of a figure called the suffering servant. And the big question, the one people have been asking for thousands of years, is simple: who is he? The text itself is haunting. It's a poem, really. It describes a man who is not what you'd expect from a hero. He isn't handsome or mighty. People look at him and see nothing special. In fact, they look down on him. They reject him. He's a man of sorrows, familiar with grief. People hide their faces from him. He's despised, but then the poem pivots. It says, "This suffering isn't for his own sake." The narrator, speaking for a group of people, has a stunning realization. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, they say. We thought God was punishing him for his own sins, but we were wrong. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. The description gets even more graphic. It says, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray. We've each turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on this servant the iniquity of us all." He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he didn't open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Like a sheep before its shearers is silent, he didn't speak. He's taken away by a corrupt legal process. He's cut off from the land of the living, he dies, and his grave is assigned with the wicked. But he ends up with the rich in his death. And here's a key line: he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. He was innocent. The poem then says this was God's will. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. Yet, his suffering will lead to something incredible. His life is made a guilt offering. After he suffers, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. He will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and through him the will of the Lord will prosper. "My righteous servant," God says, "will justify many. He will bear their iniquities." It ends on a triumphant note. Therefore, God will give him a portion among the great. He will divide the spoils with the strong. Why? Because he poured out his life unto death, was numbered with the transgressors, bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So that's the picture. A rejected, suffering, innocent man dies for the sins of others. His death is a sacrifice. And after his death, he is exalted by God and brings justification, or a right standing with God, to many people. It's an incredible, revolutionary idea. The question remains, who is this about? There are two main long-standing answers to this question. There are other smaller theories, but these are the big ones that have shaped history: the traditional Jewish understanding and the traditional Christian understanding. They are very different. Let's look at them honestly. First, the Jewish interpretation. For many centuries, Jewish scholars have identified the suffering servant not as a single person, but as the nation of Israel. This isn't a random idea they pulled out of thin air. It has a strong basis in the book of Isaiah itself. Just a few chapters earlier, in Isaiah 49, God says, "You are my servant Israel, in whom I will display my splendor." The language is direct. God calls the nation of Israel his servant. The theme runs through this section of the book. The Esservant songs, as scholars call them, are a series of 4 poems, and Isaiah 53 is the last and most dramatic one. In the earlier songs, the servant is sometimes clearly identified as Israel. So, if the servant is Israel, how does the description in chapter 53 fit? Think about the history of the Jewish people. Despised and rejected. For much of history, yes, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. This describes the collective experience of exile, persecution, and pogroms. Other nations have often looked at Israel's suffering and thought, they must have deserved it. God is punishing them for their sins. This matches the line. We considered him punished by God. The idea of being wounded for others' transgressions can be understood this way. Israel's suffering serves a purpose in God's plan for the world. Through its unique covenant with God and its steadfastness through immense pain, Israel acts as a light to the nations. Its suffering is a testimony, a strange and difficult path that ultimately brings knowledge of God to the world. The sins of the world, in a sense, are laid upon the nation, which bears them through history. The healing that comes from Israel's wounds could be the spiritual healing that the world receives by eventually turning to the God of Israel. The nations that oppress Israel will one day realize their mistake, as the poem says. They will be shocked. We were the ones who were wrong, they will confess. Israel suffered for our sake, to preserve the knowledge of the one true God. What about the servant's death? How can a nation die? This is often interpreted as the national catastrophe of the Babylonian exile. The kingdom of Judah was destroyed. The temple was torn down. The people were carried away. It was a national death. The nation was cut off from the land of the living. And the vindication at the end? The servant seeing his offspring and prolonging his days. This fits with the restoration of Israel from exile. The people returned, they rebuilt the temple, and the nation lived on. Israel's offspring are the subsequent generations who carry on the covenant. Despite being nearly wiped out, the Jewish people have survived. Their days have been prolonged against all odds. This interpretation is powerful. It's consistent with other parts of Isaiah. It speaks to the real historical suffering of a people, but it also has its challenges. There are parts of Isaiah 53 that are difficult to fit with a collective national identity. For example, the servant is described as being completely righteous. He had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Can this be said of an entire nation? The rest of the Old Testament, including other parts of Isaiah, is very clear that the nation of Israel was not sinless. In fact, the reason for the exile was explicitly stated to be the nation's sin and idolatry. The prophets constantly called the people to repent. So, how can a sinful nation be the sinless servant who dies for the sins of others? This is a major point of tension. Some Jewish commentators resolve this by saying the servant represents the righteous remnant within Israel. Not every single person, but the core of faithful believers who suffered unjustly alongside the guilty. Another tricky part is the specific phrasing. The text says, the servant suffers for my people's transgression. If the servant is Israel, and the speaker represents the people of Israel, it sounds like Israel is suffering for Israel's transgression. That seems circular. However, if the speaker is understood as the Gentile nations, or the kings mentioned at the end of Isaiah 52, then it makes more sense. The nations are realizing that the servant Israel suffered because of the nation's sins. The individual nature of the language is also a challenge. The text consistently uses he and him. It sounds like one person. A lamb to the slaughter, a man of sorrows, his grave, here his death. While Hebrew can use singular pronouns for a collective group like a king representing his kingdom, the description here feels intensely personal. So the interpretation of Israel as the servant is strong, especially in its literary context within Isaiah, but it leaves some difficult questions unanswered. Now, let's look at the other major interpretation. The Christian understanding is that the suffering servant is Jesus Christ. From the very beginning of Christianity, the followers of Jesus saw him in this chapter. The New Testament quotes from Isaiah 53 and applies it directly to Jesus. The fit seems, to Christians, to be incredibly precise. Let's walk through it again, this time with Jesus in mind. He was despised and rejected by men. The Gospels describe Jesus' ministry. While he had followers, the religious and political leaders of his own people largely rejected him. He was ultimately handed over to be crucified. A man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. Jesus' life, as portrayed in the Gospels, was not one of ease. He was homeless. He wept over Jerusalem. He agonized in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. This is the core of Christian theology. The belief is that on the cross, Jesus took the punishment for humanity's sin. His physical piercing by nails and a spear is seen as a literal fulfillment of the prophecy. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is the concept of substitutionary atonement. Jesus, the innocent one, stands in the place of guilty humanity. He takes the sin of the world upon himself. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This is one of the most striking parallels. The Gospels describe Jesus' trials before the high priest, Pilate, and Herod. When accused, he often remained silent, refusing to defend himself. This puzzled Pilate. It perfectly matches the image of the silent lamb. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Jesus was crucified between two criminals, a death reserved for the wicked. After he died, a wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea asked for his body and buried him in his own new tomb. This detail, of dying with the wicked but being buried with the rich, seems remarkably specific. Though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, a central Christian belief is the sinlessness of Jesus. He was the perfect, unblemished sacrifice, the only one who could die for the sins of others, because he had no sin of his own. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life. He will see his offspring and prolong his days. This is interpreted as the resurrection. Jesus didn't stay dead, he rose from the grave. This is the ultimate vindication. His offspring are all those who believe in him, the church. He prolongs his days by living eternally. My righteous servant will justify many. In Christian theology, people are justified or made right with God, not by their own good works, but by faith in what Jesus did for them. His sacrifice makes it possible for many to be forgiven. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. The image is of Jesus on the cross praying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And in Christian belief, he continues to intercede for believers. The Christian interpretation sees a point-for-point correspondence between the prophecy in Isaiah 53 and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. For Christians, this is one of the most powerful proofs that Jesus was the promised Messiah. The details seem too specific, too uncanny to be a coincidence. Of course, this interpretation also faces questions. The most significant one is historical context. Isaiah was writing over 700 years before Jesus was born. How could he have known these specific details? Christians believe this is the nature of divine prophecy, as God revealed the future to his prophet. For someone who doesn't believe in predictive prophecy, this is a major hurdle. They would argue that the gospel writers, knowing Isaiah 53, may have shaped their narratives of Jesus' passion to fit the prophecy. For example, did they emphasize Jesus' silence because they wanted to connect him to the silent lamb of Isaiah? Or did Jesus remain silent, and his followers later made the connection? It's a question of which came first, the event or the interpretation. Christians believe the event came first. Skeptics suggest the story was written to match the prophecy. Another question relates to the other servant songs. As mentioned before, the servant is identified as Israel in other parts of Isaiah. Why would the identity suddenly shift from the nation to a single future individual? Christians might answer that the identity of the servant is progressive. It starts with the nation of Israel, which was meant to be a light to the world, but it failed in its mission because of sin. So, the mission is ultimately fulfilled by one individual who comes from Israel, the perfect Israelite, the Messiah. He succeeds where the nation failed. In this view, the servant is both Israel and, ultimately, Jesus, who embodies the ideal of Israel. So we have these two powerful, compelling interpretations. One is rooted in the immediate literary context of Isaiah and the historical experience of the Jewish people. The other is rooted in the events described in the New Testament and the foundational beliefs of Christianity. Are there any other possibilities? Some scholars have suggested the servant was a contemporary historical figure. Perhaps Isaiah himself describing his own suffering as a prophet, or the prophet Jeremiah who suffered greatly for speaking God's word. Maybe it was a king, like Hezekiah or Josiah. The problem with these theories is that none of these figures fully fit the description. None of them died a sacrificial death for the sins of the people in the way Isaiah 53 describes. And none of them were exalted and vindicated after death in such a dramatic, world-changing way. They were righteous men, they suffered, but the scale of Isaiah 53 seems to demand someone more significant. The servant's suffering brings healing to us all, and he justifies many. This sounds like a global, not just a local, impact. These theories don't have the explanatory power of the two main interpretations. So, let's step back for a moment. What makes this chapter so powerful, regardless of who you think the servant is? It's the idea at its heart, the idea of vicarious suffering. One person suffering in the place of another. This is a radical concept. In most ancient religions, and even in our modern world, the basic idea of justice is that you get what you deserve. If you do good, you get rewarded. If you do bad, you get punished. It's a system of merit. The idea that an innocent person could be punished in place of the guilty, and that this could somehow be seen as a good thing, a healing thing, turns justice on its head. Isaiah 53 introduces this profound mystery into the world. It suggests that the deepest form of love and redemption isn't about power and victory, but about sacrifice and suffering. The hero of this story isn't a conquering king on a war horse. He's a silent lamb being led to slaughter. He wins not by killing his enemies, but by dying for them. This changes how you think about God. Is God the one who demands punishment? Or is God the one who, in the person of the servant, absorbs the punishment? The text says, it was the Lord's will to crush him. This is a difficult line to understand. It suggests that this suffering wasn't a random tragedy, but part of a divine plan. A terrible, painful, but ultimately redemptive plan. It also changes how you think about strength. The servant's power is in his weakness. His victory is in his surrender. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't curse his accusers. He absorbs the violence and hatred of the world, and through his innocent suffering, he transforms it. This is why Isaiah 53 has resonated so deeply with so many people for so long. It speaks to the reality of suffering in the world. We all know that innocent people suffer. This chapter gives that suffering a potential meaning. It suggests that redemptive power can come from the most unlikely places. So, where do we land? Who is the suffering servant? An honest exploration has to acknowledge the strengths of both the Jewish and Christian views. The argument for Israel as the servant is textually grounded in the book of Isaiah. It honors the historical context in which it was written. It provides a powerful framework for understanding the unique and often painful history of the Jewish people as part of God's plan. It sees the nation as a corporate personality suffering for the sake of the world. The argument for Jesus as the servant is grounded in the events of the New Testament. It offers a stunningly precise fulfillment of the specific details in the text. It provides the theological foundation for the Christian faith that one perfect man died for the sins of the whole world. It's possible to hold these views in a kind of tension. Perhaps the prophecy works on multiple levels. It could be that Isaiah was originally describing the suffering of the nation of Israel in exile. The language is poetic and evocative. It captures the trauma of a people. But perhaps the prophecy was designed by God to be bigger than its original context. Like a seed, it had a potential that would only be fully realized much later. It could describe Israel and also point beyond Israel to a future individual who would embody that suffering and redemption perfectly. In this way of thinking, Israel is the corporate servant, but the ultimate expression of that servanthood is found in one person, the Messiah. He is the ultimate Israelite, fulfilling the nation's calling in a way the nation itself never could. This doesn't resolve the debate, of course. For traditional Judaism, to say the servant is Jesus is to abandon the plain context of Isaiah. For traditional Christianity, to say the servant is only Israel is to miss the whole point of the gospel. The identity of the suffering servant is one of the great dividing lines between these two faiths. And it all comes back to this one, mysterious chapter. What we can say for sure is that Isaiah 53 is a masterpiece of literature and theology. It presents a vision of redemption that is counterintuitive and profound. It tells us that God's plan is not always what we expect. His chosen instrument is not a triumphant warrior, but a rejected servant. His path to glory is not through power, but through pain. His method of healing is through wounds. Ultimately, the question of who the servant is forces us to ask even bigger questions. What is the nature of suffering? Where can we find hope in a broken world? What does true justice look like? And what is God really like? Whether you see the servant as a nation that has endured for millennia, or as a man who died on a cross 2,000 years ago, the message is strangely similar. The redemption is costly. It comes through sacrifice, and the one who suffers for others is the one who is ultimately lifted up by God. The answer you land on depends on the story you believe tells the truth about our world. The story of a chosen people and their long journey through history, or the story of a chosen son and his final journey to a cross. Both stories find their voice in the haunting words of Isaiah 53.